Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Strong Stoic Podcast. I am your host, Brandon Tumblin. I'm going to be real honest with you right now. The power's out at my house, and it's probably going to be out for a while. This is post-Hurricane Fiona, and so I'm making do. I mean, don't worry about me. I got a generator, and I'm doing okay. I got running water. I got food, but it was kind of weird because I have to set up my studio a little differently because everything's battery operated now for me to get through this episode, so the lighting's a little bit off and everything, but I got one screen to work with because I can't plug in my monitor. The generator makes way too much noise for the recording, but anyways, just figured I'd give you a little update on my personal situation. But this episode is actually inspired by a quote by Epictetus that really got me thinking, and I think it's timely given really that I did an episode recently called God is Dead, and it may sound a bit odd that I'm naming an episode God's Nature after doing an episode called God is Dead, because, well, hey, we've already established that God is dead, right? But bear with me, because as I always say, things are complicated, and the Stoics were rational beings that were far from stupid. So what did they mean by God's nature? And I'm not going to give you the quote until later, so you're not that lucky. But what's up with God's nature? What's going on with that? And should we even consider, God's nature to be an even thing, if such a thing exists? This podcast is part of the Walled Garden Podcast Network. Check out thewallgarden.com to learn more. Also, consider joining my Patreon and supporting me on there at Brandon Tumblin. Financial support is not expected, but it's deeply appreciated. Also, really consider joining my Telegram group chat. Go on there to join the discussion of other strong Stoics. People are coming on there. I'm getting people coming on there. Listen, if 10% of you were to go on there right now, that would be a huge jump. So please do that. I know the numbers. I know a lot of you aren't on that group. Please go join. Also, my articles are on Medium and the Stoic Gym. And in fact, if you could do one thing for me to be able to make money from my articles on Medium, I need 100 followers, and it's not that many, and I have a lot more listeners than that. So if you could just go on there and follow me on Medium, it would be greatly, greatly appreciated. I think I'm at like 87 now or something like that. I only need 13 more. So really, really just please go and do that. That would help me out a bunch. Let's talk about the idea of God from a psychological perspective. When most people hear that word God, they think about something like a deity, meaning a supernatural, quote, quote, man in the clouds, essentially. And Family Guy did a great job in portraying this idea, or parodying. They did a parody of this idea, I guess. They made fun of this idea of God as being a man in the clouds, is what I'm trying to say here. And as I've discussed in the past, the idea of God, it's a lot more complicated than simply a man in the clouds. And I did an episode with Stoic author Kai Whiting, so please go and check that one out if you're interested for an in-depth discussion on the idea of God, because God can mean just a plethora of different things, and we're very ignorant to consider it only as a quote, quote, man in the clouds. But Jordan Peterson perhaps puts this the best. He is a clinical psychologist after all, and we're looking at this from a psychological standpoint. His idea about God is essentially that the idea of God is whatever is the highest good for you. Okay, so it's an ideal, essentially. It's the highest good. Now, if you can imagine what the perfect person would be, and then you could define what qualities they have that make them perfect, well, you'd have something like God. For example, what seems to be regarded as universally noble is the idea that you bear your suffering nobly. Interesting, eh? Sure, that's a very Christian idea, but even taking the religion out of it, it does seem to be the case that we have a deep respect for those who accept death willingly or who are really sick but bear it nobly. We have a real deep, profound respect for these people. Now, those two examples I gave, death and sickness, you might call these tragedies of life. Sure, they aren't the only ones, though. I mean, there's heartbreak, there's betrayal, there's exile. The list goes on and on and on. We could say that, really, if we extract out this idea to the extreme, that the noblest, most virtuous person is he who is able to virtuously bear the most tragic life. And that is really the story of Christ, essentially, right? However, you could also look at that idea among the Stoics. I mean, Marcus Aurelius, for example, he had one hell of a reign. You could say, yeah, sure, he was an emperor. He got to do whatever he wanted. Well, that's a really naive view of what an emperor is. And sure, some have done that throughout history. But when you're a leader, you can't just do whatever you want. You don't have freedom. That's not exactly how it works. I mean, he dealt with a plague. He dealt with the death of many friends. He dealt with his own death, surely, but also the politics that make up the political realm. I mean, he has a whole section of his book dedicated to that idea of how to deal with these rambling, crazy, annoying politicians that really just, they play the political game. I'm sure you know what I mean by that. Betrayal, heartbreak, he has stuff going on with his wife and his friends. And it's just, he had one hell of a life if you really look at what he had to go through. Epictetus is another great example of someone, I mean, he was literally a slave and had to deal with, being a slave. That can't be fun, right? In fact, it's a Stoic practice to mentally prepare for all of the tragedies that may befall you. I mean, exile, social isolation, death, pain, death of others, plague, imprisonment. This practice is called premeditatio malorum. It's the same idea as the one in Christianity. The quote-quote hero is the most virtuous person despite the most tragic life. Now, certainly Stoicism doesn't promote creating tragedy for no reason. They're not about going out there and making up tragedy, rather. And I'm certainly not arguing that you can't be virtuous if you have an easy life. I mean, certainly if you have an easy life, you can be virtuous. Why not, right? But what I'm saying is that if you're looking at a role model, if you're looking at the perfect person, the god, so to speak, the sage, you'd look at someone who has had a very tragic existence but was virtuous anyway. That seems to be the hero of the story, of the heroes of the stories. Epictetus was a slave, remember. Again, he had one hell of a life. And some modern Stoics even consider Seneca, interestingly enough, not a Stoic because he lived in wealth, which, by the way, that's not a great reason to discount someone as being a Stoic. I mean, I hate to break it to you, but you can be rich and be a Stoic. You can have money and be a Stoic. You can have money and be virtuous. They don't go hand in hand. As money and being a bad person does not go hand in hand. So the people that just say that, Seneca was rich and he was living in comfort, therefore he was not a Stoic. I mean, come on, really? That's a very naive look at Seneca. And if you look at what he had to deal with Emperor Nero, I mean, I think he was a deeply, deeply troubled individual. But anyways, psychologically, God is whatever is at the top of your hierarchy of values. And for the Stoic, it's accepting your fate, not fearing death, living by the cardinal virtues. In a sense, in one word, we could say the sage. But why do we even need a hierarchy of values? Meaning, why do we need to value some things as better than others? I mean, certainly this idea is under attack in the West right now. We're struggling with the notion that some ways of life may or may not be better than other ways of life. Now, that isn't to say that, again, people shouldn't have the right to choose which way they live. I mean, of course, people should have the right to choose which way they live, within reason, of course. You can't harm each other, and it has to be a just way of living. However, we must also admit that some ways of life are inherently better than others. And for those who may say otherwise, I'd encourage you to consider what it is that you are promoting, because even if you value that everyone should be left alone and be able to do whatever the hell they want, that's still valuing something. That's valuing compassion. You cannot help, no matter what way of life that you live or want to promote, you cannot help but promote one way of life because you have to have something that's at the top of your value system. Now, I simply disagree, along with many philosophers and many thinkers today, that compassion is the only virtue. It's simply not the only virtue. I mean, I tend to align well with Stoicism, of course, which values the cardinal virtues, justice, wisdom, courage, and temperance, and truth, of course, and living according to nature. And though compassion, I think, is a virtue, it's definitely not a cardinal virtue. But to get back to the question, why do we need to value some things more than others? And the answer is because, we need to know how to best act in the world. All you have is this present moment. That's all you have. And you can only do one thing at each time, at each present moment. So the question is, what do you do with this present moment? Now, at at this moment, you are deeming listening to my attempt at spreading wisdom in hopes that maybe you can improve your life. I mean, that's kind of the idea of listening to podcasts. I listen to them too. But the idea is, well, listen, I'm going to spend this 20 minutes, however long this episode is. I'm going to listen to Dr. Strong Stoic. I'm not a doctor, by the way. I should be very careful with that. Let's say Mr. Strong Stoic, and see if I can get some wisdom out of his attempt to spread wisdom. And so you're deeming that as something that's worth doing right now. And it might not be the same prioritization at every point in time. Like, sure, I'm assuming you're not going to want to listen to me all the time. I'm assuming at some point in your day you're going to want to do some work. You're probably going to want to eat, probably going to want to talk with a friend or something like that. So it's not to say that you have one priority and one prioritized action that governs your whole life. No, like when you awake in the morning, for example, you may ideally prioritize, having a shower to wake up and maybe having a cup of coffee, getting dressed, going to work. That's your priority at that point in time. The purpose of that is to start your day so that you can hopefully get some work done. But showering is hardly the priority when you're in the middle of a meeting talking with your work guys, right? I mean, that's not going to be something that comes to mind as a priority. In sum, you need a hierarchy of values so that you know how to act in the world. But it's not as simple as work all the time or shower all the time. I mean, really, that's against the idea or the virtue, rather, of temperance, of moderation, and certainly of wisdom. It's complicated. That's why it's best to have a quote, God. Now, that God can be the Christian God. It can be the Stoic framework and set of values. It can be the existentialist framework and set of values. It simply has to be some set of values that you deem more important, some virtues that you deem the most important, that you deem cardinal. Or it can simply be a person who you really respect. Now, you can think about it like that too, this idea of God as being something to aim at. Who do I want to become? I mean, you can also think about it as a person. Like, our parents, for many of us, represent really gods in our eyes when we're young. If you think about how you think about your parents when you're like 5, you think about them as perfect. You think they have all the answers. They know what's going on. Somewhere along the line, you realize that no, actually, they're just people. They're not gods. But for a very significant part of our life, we consider our parents to represent our ideal. Now, maybe today, modern day, in your 20s or 30s, maybe your boss at work is someone that you are striving to be like. If you respect them, maybe you're trying to imitate them. You would like to be more like them. Now, maybe you respect more than one person. Maybe you respect like 10 people equally. So you have your boss at work, and you have your neighbor, and you have, your old family friend, and maybe you have one of your parents or two of your parents and another friend. Maybe you have 10 people that you can think of like, wow, damn, I would like to be more like them. Then you can ask yourself, well, what values are common among them all? It's like, okay, well, let's break this down. They all work hard. They all care about and take care of their family. They're all kind and nice people. They don't complain. They find time for fun. They know how to laugh. And what you end up with when you extract out what all of those 10 people have is an ideal. It's someone, in this case, who takes on responsibility, who takes care of other people. They're kind, they bear life suffering nobly, and they know how to have a good time. That's your ideal. Certainly close to my ideal anyway. And now we arrive at the quote that I mentioned and alluded to earlier but did not state, because I didn't want to scare anyone away with all this God talk, even though, I put it in the name of the episode. But anyways, here's the quote. The philosophers say that there is a God and that his will directs the universe. But the more important lesson is to discover God's nature. Epictetus. Sometimes you'll hear an atheist say something like, well, the way I see it is, if God doesn't exist, well, he doesn't exist, and that's it. And we all die, and we vanish into nothingness. But if he does exist, if there is an afterlife, well, he'll let me into heaven because I'm a good person. If I'm a good person and there is a God, he probably won't care if I believe in him. He'll just let me into heaven. Now, a lot of religions would disagree with that notion, by the way. But I've heard several atheists say things like that. And what they really mean when they say that is, I don't really care if there is a supernatural God or not. I have a set of values that I deem divine. And if by chance there is a God, because Well, let's say there is a God, and because I know his nature, because I know his values, because I'm choosing to live by his values, he'll look on me favorably. We can bicker back and forth all day long, pretty much our entire lives, and even further than that, we've been bickering for a very long time about whether or not God is real. However, to Epictetus, it doesn't really matter. We don't need to know if God exists. All we really need to know is God's nature. In other words, all we really need to know is what values are we choosing to adopt? What do we want to consider as the highest good? Who do we want to become? And then we need to make conscious efforts to move closer to that. We don't need to know if God exists. All we need to know is God's nature. And all we really need to know is how to act divinely. Maybe there is no God, but that doesn't mean that we can't act godlike. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you're new here, episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. Consider leaving a rating and review wherever you're listening to this. I really appreciate that. Check me out on Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. Starting to try and promote YouTube a bit more as well. I'm getting into shorter clips there, so please go check that out. Would love to see you subscribe on there. Not going to bug you anymore. Thanks again. Cheers. Until next time.